Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Well, welcome to celebrate a national birthday party which happens every year on the third Monday of January. And this year of 2020 and every year we celebrate the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I see many of you young people looking at me and saying, shaking your head, who is that? Well, Martin Luther King Jr.'s original name was Michael King Jr., born in Atlanta, Georgia on January 15th, 1929, which was just 2 years later, almost to the day that I was born. I keep wondering, how does he ever get to be so smart and just 2 years earlier with the difference in our ages? He was an American religious leader and social rights activist who led the civil rights movement in the United States. His leadership was fundamental to that movement's success in ending the legal segregation of African Americans. Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis at the ripe old age of 39 years. In those limited years of life, Dr. King accomplished more than most people in our nation's history ever can accomplish. And he was the youngest person, unbelievable to me, the youngest person ever awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his outstanding contributions for peace. He is most famous for his "I Have a Dream" speech, which I recommend you must read. Dr. King's quotes are famous to this day. Before giving his talk and his acceptance on December 11th, 1964 for the Nobel Peace Prize, I feel commanded to read one of his most memorable quotes. Our lives begin to end the day that we are silent about things that matter. Our lives end on the day that we are silent for things that matter. Let that soak into your mind for a moment. Well, please pay strict attention to what mattered to Dr. King in 1964. Listen carefully to see if they match you and America and the world in this new year of 2020. Can we stop for a minute now, T? Let me get a drink of water, which I hadn't done. I am going to read every word of the speech that Martin Luther King gave as his acceptance speech of the Nobel Prize. It was titled "The Quest for Peace and Justice." And what Dr. King said, and allow me the time to go through the whole talk. It's inspirational, it's articulate, it has unique phrasing, but always a message of a lesson to learn for you and me and everyone. It's really, if we follow it, it's for our own good. Well, I will start with the quest of peace. It is impossible to begin this lecture without again expressing my deep appreciation to the Nobel Committee of the Norwegian Parliament for bestowing upon me and the civil rights movement in the United States such a great honor. Occasionally in life, there are those moments of unutterable fulfillment which cannot be completely explained, by those symbols called words. Their meaning can only be articulated by the inaudible language of the heart. Such is the moment, and I am presently experiencing. I experience this high and joyous moment not for myself alone, but for those devotees of nonviolence who have moved so courageously against the ramparts of racial injustice, and who, in the process, have acquired a new estimate of their own human worth. Many of them are young and cultured, others are middle-aged and middle class. The majority are poor. The richer we have become materially, the poorer we have become morally and spiritually. We have learned to fly the air like birds and swim the sea like fish, but we have not learned the simple art of living together as brothers. Every man lives in two realms, the internal and the external. The internal is that realm of spiritual ends expressed in art, literature, morals, and religion. The external is that complex of devices, techniques, mechanisms, and instrumentalities by means of which we live. Our problem today is that we have allowed the internal to become lost in the external. We have swallowed the means by which we live to outdistance the ends for which we live. So much of modern life can be summarized in that arresting dictum of the poet Thoreau. Improved means to an unimproved end. Improved means to an unimproved end. This is the serious predicament, the deep and haunting problem confronting modern man. If we are to survive today, our moral and spiritual lag must be eliminated. Enlarged material powers spell enlarged peril. If there is not proportionate growth of the soul, well, within the outs of man's nature subjugates the within. Dark storm clouds begin to form in the world. This problem of spiritual and moral lag, which constitutes modern man's chief dilemma, expresses itself in three larger problems which grow out of man's ethical infantilism. The first problem that I would like to mention is racial injustice. The struggle to eliminate the evil of racial injustice constitutes one of the major struggles of our time. The present upsurge of the Negro people of the United States grows out of deep and passionate determination to make freedom and equality a reality here and now. In one sense, the civil rights movement in the United States is a special American phenomenon, which must be understood in the light of American history and dealt with in terms of American situation. But on another and more important level, what is happening in the United States today is a relatively small part of world development. We live in a day, says the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, when civilization is shifting its basic outlook, a major turning point in history where the presuppositions on which society is structured are being analyzed, sharply challenged, and profoundly changed. What we are seeing now is a freedom explosion, the realization of an idea whose time has come, to use Victor Hugo's phrase. The deep rumbling of discontent that we hear today is the thunder of disinherited masses rising from dungeons of oppression to the bright hills of freedom. In one majestic chorus, the rising masses singing in the words of a freedom song, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn us around." All over the world, like a fever, the freedom movement is spreading in the widest liberation in history. The great masses of people are determined to end the exploitation of their races and land. They are awake and moving toward their goal like a tidal wave. You can hear them rumbling in every village street and on the docks, in the houses, among the students, in the churches, and at political meetings. Historic movement was for several centuries of the nations and societies of Western Europe out into the rest of the world in conquest of various sorts. That period, the era of colonialism, is at an end. East is meeting West. The earth is being redistributed. Yes, we are shifting our basic outlooks. These developments should not surprise any student of history. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself. The Bible tells the thrilling story of how Moses stood in Pharaoh's court centuries ago and cried, "Let my people go." This is a kind of opening chapter in a continuing story. Something within has reminded the Negro of his birthright of freedom, and something without that has reminded him that it can be gained. Consciously or unconsciously, he has been caught up by the zeitgeist, and within his black brothers of America and his brown and yellow brothers in Asia, South America, and the Caribbean, the United States Negro is moving with a great sense of urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. Fortunately, some significant strides have been made in the struggle to end the long night of racial injustice. We have seen the magnificent drama of independence unfold in Asia and Africa. Just 30 years ago, there were only 3 independent nations in the whole of Africa. But today, 35 African nations have risen from colonial bondage into being whole. In the United States, we have witnessed the gradual demise of the system of racial segregation. The Supreme Court's constitutional death blow to the whole doctrine of separate but equal. The court decreed that separate facilities are inherently unequal, and that to segregate a child on the basis of race is to deny that child equal protection of the law. This decision came as a beacon light of hope to millions of disinherited people. Then came that glowing day a few months ago when a strong civil rights bill became the law of our land. This bill, which was first recommended and promoted by President Kennedy, was passed because of the overwhelming support and perseverance of millions of Americans, both Negro and white. It came as a bright interlude in the long and sometimes turbulent struggle for civil rights, the beginning of a second Emancipation Proclamation providing a comprehensive legal basis for equality of opportunity. Since the passage of this bill, we have seen some encouraging and surprising signs of compliance. I am happy to report that by and large, communities all over the southern part of the United States are obeying the civil rights law and showing remarkable good sense in the process. Another indication that progress is being made was found in the recent presidential election in the United States. The American people revealed great maturity by overwhelmingly rejecting a presidential candidate who had become identified with extremism, racism, and retrogression. The voters of our nation rendered a telling blow to the radical right. They defeated those elements in our society which seek to pit white against Negro and lead the nation down a dangerous path, a fascistic path. Let me not leave you with a false impression. The problem is far from solved. We still have a long, long way to go before the dream of freedom is a reality for the Negro in the United States. To put it figuratively in biblical language, we have left the dusty soils of Egypt and crossed the Red Sea, whose waters had for years been hardened by a long and piercing winter of massive resistance. But before we reach the majestic shores of the Promised Land, there is a frustrating and bewildering wilderness ahead. We must still face prodigious hilltops of opposition and gigantic mountains of resistance. But with patient and firm determination, we will press on until every valley of despair is exalted to new peaks of hope, until every mountain of pride and irrationality is smothered and smoothed with the plain of equality, of opportunity, and until the crooked places of prejudice are transformed by the straightening process of bright-eyed wisdom. What the main section of the civil rights movement in the United States is saying is that the demand for dignity, equality, jobs, and citizenship will not be abandoned or diluted or postponed. If that means resistance and conflict, we shall not flinch. We shall not be coward. We are no longer afraid. The word that symbolizes the spirit and the outward form of our encounter is non-violence. And it is doubtless that factor which made it seem appropriate to award a Peace Prize to one identified with the struggle. Briefly speaking, nonviolence in the civil rights struggle has meant not relying on arms and weapons of struggle. It has meant non-cooperation with customers and laws, I should say with customs and laws, which are institutional respects of regime of discrimination and enslavement. It has meant direct participation of masses in protest rather than reliance on indirect methods which frequently do not involve massive of action at all. Nonviolence also means that my people in the agonizing struggle of recent years have taken suffering upon themselves instead of inflicting it on others. It has meant, as I had said, that we are no longer afraid and coward. But in some substantial degree, it has meant that we do not want to instill fear in others or into the society of which we are a part. The movement does not seek to liberate Negroes at the expense of the humiliation and enslavement of whites. It seeks no victory over anyone. It seeks to liberate American society and to share in the self-liberation of all the people. Violence is a way of achieving racial justice, is both impractical and immoral. I am not unmindful of the fact that violence often brings about momentary results. Nations have frequently won their independence in battle, but in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Violence is impractical because it is the descending spiral ending in destruction for all. It is immoral because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. It seeks to annihilate rather than to convert. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. It leaves society in monologue rather than dialogue. Violence ends up defeating itself. It creates bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the survivors. In a real sense, nonviolence seeks to redeem the spiritual and moral lag that I spoke of earlier. And as the chief dilemma of modern men, it seeks to secure moral ends through moral means. Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon. Indeed, it is a weapon unique in history, which cuts without wounding and ennobles the man who wields it. I believe in this method because I think it is the only way to reestablish a broken community. It is the method which seeks to implement just the law by appealing to the conscience of the great decent majority who through blindness, fear, pride, and irrationality have allowed their consciousness to go to sleep. The nonviolent resistors can summarize their message in the following simple terms. We will take direct action against injustice despite the failures of governmental and other official agencies to act first. We will not obey unjust laws or submit to unjust practices. We will do this peacefully, openly, cheerfully, because our aim is to persuade. We adopt this means of nonviolence because our end is a community at peace with itself. We will try to persuade with our words, but if our words fail, we will try to persuade with our acts. We will always be willing to talk and seek fair compromise, but we are ready to suffer when necessary and even risk our lives to become witnesses to truth as we see it. This approach to the problem of racial injustice is not at all without successful precedent. It was used in a magnificent way by Mohandas K. Gandhi to challenge the might of the British Empire and free his people from the political discrimination and economic exploitation inflicted upon them for centuries. He struggled only with the weapons of truth, soul force, non-injury, and mostly courage. In the past 10 years, unarmed, gallant men and women of the United States have given living testimony to the moral power and efficacy of nonviolence by the thousands faceless, anonymous, relentless young people, black and white, have temporarily left the activities to become a refreshing oasis in a desert sweltering with the heat of injustice. They have taken our whole nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by our founding fathers in the formation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. One day, all America will be proud of their achievement. I am only too well aware of the human weaknesses and failures which exist, the doubts about the efficacy of nonviolence, and the open advocacy of violence by some. But I am still convinced that nonviolence, in both the most practically sound and morally acceptable way, is to grapple with the age-old problem of racial injustice. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a confession to make to you. You may not understand, but I am now 93 years old, a veteran from World War II, 2 years older, as I said earlier, than Martin Luther King. And what happened is something that I cannot control. But from the war, watching my buddies getting wounded and killed, it left an indelible impression somewhere in my mind. I don't think about it often, but whenever I'm under a strain, I faint. I can't help myself. I get dizzy, and I'm on the ground before I know it. And just as I said the couple of words before this, I couldn't help it. That meant I can shiver, and I have little control, and next thing I know, I'm on the ground. Well, hopefully, during this next part of the program, but please understand, the interruption, it isn't Dr. Martin Luther King. This speech is so elegant, so important, so beautiful, that I just am compelled not to let it just go into history and be forgotten. I felt it is my duty, my responsibility to share it with you so that you could understand 60 years ago, that gentleman was speaking what was happening at that time. And if you are really thinking along with me and the rest of the world, we are reliving a similar situation. Some things have improved. There's no doubt about that. When I started in school, everything was segregated. We've gotten away with most of that. But still, what is happening now, the division, the divide, the hatred, and the love on another side is separating us. And that is not what Martin Luther King wants. That's not what I want. And I hope all of you, patriots of America, who love the nation, love what we stand for, want to follow our Constitution, want to follow our Declaration of Independence and bring us back together again. A second evil which plagues this modern world is that of poverty. Like a monster octopus, it projects its nagging tentacles that treat villages, cities, all over the world. Almost 2/3 of the population of the world go to bed every night hungry. They are undernourished, ill-housed, and shabbily clad. Many of them have no houses or beds to sleep in. Their only beds are the sidewalks of the cities and the dusty roads of the villages. Most of these poverty-stricken children of God have never seen a physician or a dentist. This problem of poverty is not only seen in the class division between the highly developed industrial nations and the so-called underdeveloped nations. It is seen in the great economic gaps within the rich nations themselves. Take my own country, for example. We have developed the greatest system of production that history has ever known. We have become the richest nation in the world. Our national gross product this year will reach the astounding figure of almost $650 billion. Yet, at least 1/5 of our fellow citizens, some 10 million families comprising about 40 million individuals, are bound to a miserable culture of poverty. In a sense, the poverty of the poor in America is more frustrating than the poverty of Africa and Asia. The misery of the poor in Africa and Asia is shared misery, a fact of life for the vast majority. They are all poor together as a result of years of exploitation and underdevelopment. In sad contrast, the poor in America, they know they live in the richest nation in the world, and that even though they are perishing on a lonely island of poverty, they are surrounded by a vast ocean of material prosperity. Glistening towers of glass and steel, easily seen from their slum dwellings, spring up almost overnight. Jetliners speed over their ghettos at 600 miles an hour. Satellites streak through outer space and reveal details of the moon. President Johnson, in his State of the Union message, emphasized this contradiction, I screwed that up, I'm sorry. Emphasized this contradiction, deplored that it was accompanied by dislocation, loss of jobs, and the specter of poverty in the midst of plenty. So it is obvious that if man is to redeem the spiritual and moral lag, he must go all out to bridge the social and economic gulf between the haves and the have-nots of the world. Poverty is one of the most urgent items on the agenda of modern life. There's nothing new about poverty. What is new, however, is that we have the resources to get rid of it. More than a century and a half ago, people began to be disturbed about the twin problems of population and production. A thoughtful Englishman named Malthus wrote a book that set forth some rather frightening conclusions. He predicted that the human family was gradually moving towards global starvation because the world was producing people faster than it was producing food and material to support them. Later scientists, however, disapproved the conclusion of Malthus and revealed that he had vastly underestimated the resources of the world and the resourcefulness of man. Not too many years ago, Dr. Kiltley Mather, a Harvard geologist, wrote a book entitled Enough to Spare. He set forth the basic theme that famine is wholly unnecessary, especially unnecessary in today's modern world. Therefore, the question on the agenda must read, why should there be hunger and privation in any land, in any city, at any table when man has the resources and the scientific know-how to provide all mankind with the basic necessities of life? Even deserts can be irrigated and topsoil can be replaced. We cannot complain of a lack of land, for there are 25 million square miles of tillable land, of which we are using less than 7 million. We have amazing knowledge of vitamins, nutrition, the chemistry of food, and the versatility of atoms. There is no deficit in human resources. The deficit is in human will. The well-off and the secure have too often become indifferent and oblivious to the poverty and deprivation within their midst. The poor in our countries have been shut out of our minds and driven from the mainstream of our societies because we have allowed them to become invisible. Just as nonviolence exposed the ugliness of racial injustice, so must the infection and sickness of poverty be exposed and healed, not only its symptoms, but its basic causes. This too will be a fierce struggle, but we must not be afraid to pursue the remedy, no matter how formidable the task. The time has come for all-out world war against poverty. The rich nations must use their vast resources of wealth to develop the underdeveloped, school the unschooled, and feed the unfed. Ultimately, a great nation is a compassionate nation. No individual or nation can be great if it does not have concern for the least of others. Deeply etched in the fiber of our religious tradition is the conviction that men are made in the image of God, and they are souls of infinite metaphysical value, the heirs of a legacy of dignity and worth. If we feel this as a profound moral fact, we cannot be content to see man go hungry, to see men victimized with starvation and ill health when we have the means to help them. The wealthy nations must go all out to bridge the gulf between the rich minority and the poor majority. In the final analysis, the rich must not ignore the poor, because both rich and poor are tied in a single garment of destiny. All life is interrelated, and all men are independent. The agony of the poor diminishes the rich, and the salvation of the poor enlarges the rich. We inevitably are our brother's keepers. Because of interrelated structure of reality, John Donne interpreted this truth in graphic terms when he affirmed, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the lessee, as well as if a premature were as well as if a manner of thy friends, or of these own, were any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bells tolls. It tolls for thee." A third great evil confronting our world is that of war. Recent events have vividly reminded us that nations are not reducing, but rather increasing their arsenals of weapons of mass destruction. The best brains in the highly developed nations of the world are devoted to military technology. The proliferation of nuclear weapons has not been halted in spite of the limited test ban treaty. On the contrary, the detonation of an atomic device by the first non-white, non-Western, and so-called underdeveloped power, namely the Chinese People's Republic, opens new vistas of exposure of vast multitudes, the whole of humanity, to insidious terrorization by the ever-present threat of annihilation. The fact that most of the time human beings put the truth about the nature and risks of the nuclear war out of their minds because it is too painful and therefore not acceptable. It does not alter the nature and risks of such war. The device of rejection may temporarily cover up anxiety, but it does not bestow peace of mind and emotional security. So man's proneness to engage in war is still a fact. But wisdom, born of experience, should tell us that war is obsolete. There may have been a time when war served as a negative by preventing the spread and growth of an evil force, but the destructive power of modern weapons eliminated even the possibility that war may serve as a negative good. If we assume that life is worth living and that man has a right to survive, then we must find an alternative to war. In a day when vehicles hurtle through our outer space and guided ballistic missiles carve highways of death through the atmosphere, no nation can claim victory in war. A so-called limited war will leave little more than a calamitous legacy of human suffering, political turmoil, and spiritual disillusionment. A world war, God forbid, would leave only smoldering ashes as a mute testimony of a human race whose folly led inexorably to ultimate death. So if modern man continues to flirt unhesitatingly with war, he will transform his earthly habitat into an inferno such as even the mind of Dante could not imagine. Therefore, I venture to suggest to all of you and to all who hear and may eventually read these words that the philosophy and strategy of nonviolence become immediately a subject for study and for serious experimentation in every field of human conflict, by no means excluding the relations between the nations. It is, after all, nation states which make war, which have produced the weapons which threaten the survival of all mankind. And both are genocidal and suicidal in character. Here also we have ancient habits to deal with, vast structures of power, indescribably complicated problems to solve. But unless we abdicate our humanity altogether and succumb to fear and impotence in the presence of the weapons we have ourselves created, it is an imperative and urgent to put an end to war and violence between nations, as it is to put an end to racial injustice. Equality with whites will hardly solve the problems of either whites or Negroes if it means equality in a society under the spell of terror and a world doomed to extinction. I do not wish to minimize the complexity of the problems that need to be faced in achieving disarmament and peace, but I think it is a fact that we shall not have the will, the courage, and the insight to deal with such matters unless in this field we are prepared to undergo a mental and spiritual reevaluation, a change of focus which will enable us to see that the things which seem most real and powerful are indeed now unreal and have come under the sentence of death. We need to make a supreme effort to generate the readiness, indeed the eagerness, to enter into the new world which now is possible, the city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. A foundation whose builder and maker is God. We will not build a peaceful world by following a negative path. It is not enough to say we must not wage war. It is necessary to love peace and sacrifice for it. We must concentrate not merely on the negative expulsion of war, but on the positive affirmation of peace. There is a fascinating little story that is preserved for us in Greek literature about Ulysses and the sirens. The sirens had the ability to sing so sweetly that sailors could not resist steering towards their island. Many ships were lured upon the rocks, and men forgot home, duty, and honor as they flung themselves into the sea to be embraced by arms that drew them down to death. Ulysses, determined not to be lured by the sirens, first decided to tie himself tightly to the mast of his boat, and his crew stuffed their ears with wax. But finally, he and his crew learned a better way to save themselves. They took on board the beautiful singer Orpheus, whose melodies were sweeter than the music of the sirens. When Orpheus sang, who bothered to listen to the sirens? So we must fix our vision not merely on the negative expulsion of war, but upon the positive affirmation of peace. We must see that peace represents a sweeter music, a cosmic melody that is far superior to the discords of war. Somehow, we must transform the dynamics of the world's power struggle, from the negative nuclear arms race, which no one can win, in a positive contest to harness man's creative genius for the purpose of making peace and prosperity, a reality for all the nations of the world. In short, we must shift the arms race into a peace race. If we have the will and the determination to mount such a peace offensive, we will unlock hitherto tightly sealed doors of hope and transform our imminent cosmic elegy into a song of creative fulfillment. All that I have said boils down to the point of affirming that mankind's survival is dependent upon man's ability to solve the problems of racial injustice, poverty, and war. The solution of these problems is in turn dependent upon man squaring his moral progress with his scientific progress and learning the practical art of living in harmony. Some years ago, a famous novelist died. Among his papers were found a list of suggested story plots for future stories, the most prominently underscored being this one: a widely separated family inherits a house in which they have to live together. This is the great new problem of mankind. We have inherited a big house, a great world house, in which we have to live together. Black and white, Easterners and Westerners, Gentiles and Jews, Catholics and Protestants, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interests, who, because we can never again live without each other, we must learn somehow in this one big world to live with each other. This means that more and more our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. What we must now give is an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in our individual societies. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concerns beyond one's tribe, one's race, one class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love of all men. This often misunderstood and misinterpreted concept, so readily dismissed by the Nietzsches of the world as a weak and cowardly force, has now become an absolute necessity, a necessity for the survival of man. When I speak of love, I'm not speaking of some sentimental and weak response which is little more than emotional bosh. I am speaking of that force which of all of the great religions has seen as the supreme, unifying, ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of St. John. Let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God, and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. If we love one another, God dwelleth within us, and His love is perfected in us. We hope, and let us hope, this will become the order of the day. As Arnold Toynbee says, love is the ultimate force that makes for the saving choice of life and good among the damning choice of death and evil. Therefore, the first hope in our inventory must be the hope that love is going to have the last word. We can no longer afford to worship the God of hate or bow before the altar of retaliation. The oceans of history are made turbulent by the ever-rising tides of hate. History is cluttered with the wreckage of nations and individuals that pursue this self-defeating path of hate. Love is the key to the solution of the problems of the world. Let me close by saying that I have the personal faith that mankind will somehow rise up to the occasion and give new direction to an age drifting rapidly to its doom. In spite of the tensions and uncertainties of this period, something profoundly meaningful is taking place. Old systems of exploitation and oppression are passing away, and out of the womb of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. Doors of opportunity are gradually being opened to those at the bottom of society. The shirtless and barefoot people of the land are developing a new sense of somebodiness and carving a tunnel of hope through the dark mountains of despair. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. Here and there, an individual or group dares to love and rises to the majestic heights of moral maturity. So in a real sense, this is a great time to be alive. Therefore, I am not yet discouraged about the future. Granted that the easygoing optimism of yesterday is impossible. Granted that those who pioneer in the struggle for peace and freedom will face uncomfortable jail terms, painful threats of death. They will still be battered by the storms of persecution, leading them to the nagging feeling that they can no longer bear such a heavy burden and the temptation of wanting to retreat to more quiet and serene life. Granted that we face a world crisis which leaves us standing so often amid the surging murmur of life's restless sea. But every crisis has both its dangers and its opportunities. It can spell either salvation or doom. In a dark, confused world, the kingdom of God may yet reign in the hearts of men. That is the conclusion of Martin Luther's famous speech in winning the award of the Peace Prize for doing more for anyone at that time in trying to be safety and bring comfort and peace and harmony to the world. Well, I just want to summarize my own personal feelings. I don't truly care if you're a Democrat, Independent, or Republican. I do care when we are divided or separated without cooperating for a common good for everyone. Spiritually, we the people are the united. We the people are the United States of America. Well, 2020 is a new year a new beginning. Let's unite as one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty, justice, freedom, and equality for all. Wipe away your fear and hatred. I believe there is enough love around to make hate and fear vanish from society when we work together in unity, harmony, and goodwill. May I just end and remind you, we will be celebrating Martin Luther King's birthday on the 20th of this month. I invite you to celebrate his words, his remarks, his theories, and especially his disciplines for how we can make this world a better world for all, with God, working for God, as we are all God's children. May God bless you. Thank you.
Make every day Valentine's Day. Make every dream come true. Make every day Valentine's Day. And your neighbor will love you too. Love your neighbor. Yes, love your neighbor, and your neighbor will love you.